What's going on, guys? It's Hy, and if you scan and edit your own film, then I think you're really going to like this video, because today I'm going to show you a fast and effective way of color correcting your C-41 negative scans. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory. I've been largely unhappy with the way that my color corrected C-41 scans have been looking. So I went online to see what other people were doing, and after going through a few Google pages, I came across a post from the website IamTheJeff.com titled "The Best Way to Color Correct C-41 Negative Film Scans." And if you're interested in reading this post for yourself, I'll include a link in the description of this video. In short, the author of this post created a really quick way of color correcting C-41 negative scans, and from personal experience, it seems to work very well. So in this video, I'm going to be going over this process and showing you I Am the Jeff's way of color correcting C-41 negative scans. Before we get started, here's the website again. In this post, the author essentially breaks down the entire process so that if you wanted to do this step by step, you can do so. Everything is pretty straightforward and easy to follow. For this video, I would not be doing the step-by-step process because it's not what I personally do for my scans. If you scroll down the page, there is a link to download a Photoshop action, and this is what I will be using for this video. If you're unfamiliar with Photoshop actions, they are essentially just automated commands. So once you activate an action, it just runs through the command, and this just makes doing repetitive tasks a lot easier. So for images that require the exact same edits, instead of doing the edits manually, you can just activate the action and it'll do the edits for you. In the case of the action that we're using for this video, it does the same thing. It goes through and does all of the repetitive tasks that are the same from image to image so that we don't have to waste the time and do it ourselves. I haven't mentioned this, but it should be pretty obvious by now that you will need Adobe Photoshop to get this done. If you don't use Photoshop, hopefully you use another program that takes advantage of Photoshop actions, or just go through the step-by-step guide on the website, and hopefully you can make those steps work for the program that you are using. The first thing that you would need to do is download this action and install it. For this tutorial, I'm going to assume that you have basic understanding of Photoshop and editing in general. I'm not going to go very in-depth with how everything works, but we'll try to make this process as understandable as possible. Once you have the plugin installed, you can go into Photoshop, and as you can see, I've already loaded a few different images for this demonstration. It's important to note that to accomplish what we are doing, you need to have a negative scan. I'm not talking about just scanning a film negative, but when you scan your film, it needs to be in the negative inverted form, as in how you would see it if you were holding the film negative in real life, with the orange cast and all, not flipped with normal colors. You would want your film scans to look like this in terms of color. It's also important to scan the entire frame with the edges like the ones you see around my images, and you'll see why this is in a little bit. Unfortunately, I can't show you how to do these things because they're based on the scanner software that you use. If you don't know how to do these things, find a manual for your software or another tutorial on this topic. Okay, here's the first scan that we'll be working with, and the first thing that I'm going to do is open up my actions window, and as you can see, I have the I Am the Jeff action visible. Depending on the action, you can just activate it and it does everything for you. But with this particular one, you see that the first command actually has some text attached to it. If I pull this window out, we can read that the text says, "Use the eyedropper tool to sample the orange mass of the film base. Be sure the sample size is set to average 5x5, for example. Continue playing with the action when done." This text is actually instructions for the first thing that we need to do in order to make this action work. So we just go to the side and select the eyedropper tool or use the I hotkey on the keyboard. Once you do this, make sure that the sample size option in this top option bar is set to average sample 5x5. Next, we can use the eyedropper tool to select a non-transparent section of the film, and this is why it's important to scan the entire frame of the film to leave those edges on the side. For me, with how my scanner output these files, it's going to be before and after the image. Once this is done, we can go back to the Actions menu and select the next command and just press play, and the action would do the rest for us. As you can see, we now have a positive image that looks pretty decent. Like I said, the action did a few different steps for us. If you want a more thorough explanation of what was done, read the original web post. It does a good job of explaining everything. For now though, the action has essentially taken us to the final step of this color correction process, and it is to do further color corrections by adjusting and fixing minor color shifts. If by doing the action you got something that you're happy with, you can very well just stop and be finished right here. From my personal experience though, I've never had a picture that was perfect with just the action. There was always some minor color adjustments that had to be done, and that's where these color layers come into play. If you look in the layers window, you will see that there are a few new layers. The color correct layer is pretty much set and is done. You don't have to do anything with this. Next, we have 3 layers that are filled with colors. One is filled with pure cyan, the next is filled with pure magenta, and finally we have a layer that's filled with pure yellow. Each of these layers will have an opacity of 0%. In this process, you will use these layers to correct for color shifts in your image. These layers essentially play on the idea of introducing the opposite color to negate or balance out a color that's prominent. For example, if your image is overly blue, you would want to add the opposite color, which is yellow. If your image is too green, you would want to add magenta. If it's too red, you add cyan, and the vice versa for all of those examples. This is very much like how you would adjust white balance in Lightroom, but instead of sliders, we add color by increasing the opacity of the colored layers. Let's just demonstrate this so that it's a bit easier to understand. Looking at this first image after applying the action, I would personally say that this image is overly blue. As you can see, there is a blue cast pretty much on the entire image. And like I said earlier, if an image is overly blue, you would want to add the opposite colored layer, which in this case would be yellow. With this, you would want to increase the opacity to negate the opposite color, which in this case would be blue. You can of course increase the opacity in a variety of ways. I personally like to highlight the opacity, then increase it by pressing the up and down arrows on my keyboard. This way I can increase it by increments of 1, and this allows me to make really fine adjustments. So we're just going to increase the opacity of this yellow layer until we get something that looks a little bit better. As you can see, the blue cast is really decreasing to the point that it's pretty much just gone. But now that we've added yellow to this image, the yellow itself introduced somewhat of a green cast. And because the image is overly green, we will want to go to magenta and increase this layer's opacity. And with just a few steps, you can see that the green cast is essentially gone. Now the thing with this is to not be overly crazy with the adjustments. As you can see, I'm only at 7% on the opacity for the magenta layer. It doesn't take a lot to really affect the image. If I really start to go up, you can see that there is a magenta cast on all of the faces, and that's not exactly what you would want. So I'm just going to decrease the magenta again to a point that looks neutral. And for me, about 8% looks pretty good. And just like that, with a few clicks, we have a pretty well balanced image. At this point, after the final color corrections, you are essentially done with this process. From here, you can edit the image even further by adding more traditional things like contrast, sharpness, highlights, shadow, whatever you want. But if you're happy with everything, just export it and call it a day. You probably noticed by now, but there is a 5th layer added into our layer window. This layer is titled Color Correct by IamTheJeff.com. Now this is a blank layer and has no effect on the actual image. This is just a way for the author to advertise himself and letting people know where this product came from. Again, this is a blank layer and has no effect on the image, so you can leave it or delete it, it doesn't really matter. For this video, let's go on and edit another image. First thing I'm going to do is use the eyedropper tool to get a black point, then run the action. From here we can do further color adjustments. I would personally say, just based on this man's skin tones, that this image is blue. So I'm going to add some yellow to it. And just like that, it's looking pretty good already. But again, adding yellow kind of introduced a green tint to everything. So let's just add some magenta too. And that's looking good already. And again, not much was really needed. 4% on magenta and 24% on the yellows. From my personal experience, you never really had to go all that high with these opacity layers. I don't think I've ever even gotten to 50% on one individual layer. So just keep that in mind as you're editing. Let's move on to our third image. And again, eyedropper tool, click on the film base, and run the action. Now I chose this particular image because I felt that it would be a little bit harder to color correct because this image was actually taken with the Fujifilm Quick Snap and underwater point and shoot, so the image quality won't be all that great in the first place. But as you can see here, again, we have a bit of a blue cast, so let's just introduce some yellows. And again, that's making things look a little bit green, so let's go into the magentas. And right away, the skin tones look much more natural. And the overall image really does look a lot better. Moving on to our fourth example, let's eyedropper tool, click on the film base, then run the action. Now this image is particularly tricky. I actually shot this image while the sun was setting, so there is an overall blue cast from that in the first place. But then as you can see up here, there's actually a green cast also. So there's kind of two different color casts in one image. So let's just try and compensate for these issues. First, let's do the blues by adding yellow. And now we have a green cast, or more of a green cast, so let's add some magenta. And this is looking pretty good in my opinion. But for something like this image where there are multiple sources of color cast, you can't really compensate for everything at once. For something like this, you would really want to do some additional adjustments, some selective adjustments, so you can compensate for the bottom half and the green half separately. But as far as this particular color correcting process, this is about as good as we can get, and everything is looking pretty natural. Finally, let's move on to our fifth and final image. Eyedropper tool on the film base, then run the action. Right away, everything is looking pretty natural and pretty good. But as always, a bit of a color cast, and in this case, again, everything is looking a little bit blue, so let's add some yellows. And that's looking a lot better. But looking at the whites, there are some greens, so let's add some magenta. And everything is looking just about perfect. Again, I wanted to demonstrate with this image because the lighting is a bit tricky. If you can tell, I took this image while being surrounded by a bunch of red rock canyons. And on the other hand, my subject right here is wearing a sort of off-white jacket. And if you look closely, there is a bit of a magenta or red cast on this woman's jacket. Now from personal experience, I know that this is about as good as I can get with color correcting using this process, but there is still a bit of a red cast on the jacket. In theory, this is probably from the light bouncing off the canyon walls and reflecting on the jacket to produce that color cast. I can correct for this color cast on the jacket, but just not by using this process with these three colored opacity layers. Again, I would really have to go in and selectively adjust the color of this jacket without having everything else being adjusted, because I am doing adjustments just by using these layers with this process. In theory, I can go in and add some cyans. And as you can see, the jacket does look a little bit better and a little bit more off-white without those red tones. But as I increase cyans, you can see everywhere else, it's a little bit more blue, it's a little bit more green. So that's not what I want to do. These color layers are global adjustments. They affect the entire image. This is great for minor surface level adjustments, but for something like this particular image where I'm getting multiple color casts, I will need to go in and do selective color adjustments. As you can see, this process for color correcting C-41 negative scans is pretty straightforward, easy to do, and can be quite effective. From my personal experience with this process, it seems to work with pretty much any image that I throw at it. However, there are some drawbacks. The first being that some images are just harder to edit than others, especially if they have elements introducing multiple color casts or color shifts into the scene. Really, I don't put too much fault into this process because images like the last one that I demonstrated on, really, it's difficult for any process to just flat out edit. There is really no easy way around it. Most color correcting processes use a global adjustment approach like this one, where you do one edit and it kind of affects the entire image. And this largely works on most images, but some are just harder to edit and really need refined local adjustments. Another thing about this process is that it requires the editor to kind of know what the colors of a particular scene is supposed to look like. Take that last image again for example. I knew exactly what that jacket was supposed to look like. It's supposed to be an off-white, but using the process I could only get it to a beige light tan color. If someone else were editing this image using this process, they very well may have just stopped at the light tan color because they wouldn't have known any better. And like I said, the editor really has to know what the color of a scene is supposed to look like. So in cases where you're not editing your own film scans, you're editing for someone else, or you just completely forgot what the scene looks like, once you go and edit with this process, the colors may not be true to life. Lastly, to me, this process should be utilized for creating natural tones, not so much for accurately representing a film stock. Think of it this way, some film stocks are just inherently more magenta or more green than others or real life. And if you want to accurately represent these film stocks, you have to show those color shifts. So unless you have an extremely accurate memory of just how much of a particular tint a film stock is supposed to have, it'll be very hard to represent that film stock with this process. Some film color correcting programs actually utilize an entire database of different film stocks so that it has something to reference to, whereas here we obviously do not have that. We're pretty much just eyeballing an image and seeing, does this look right, and pretty much just editing based on personal preferences. So at the end of the day, if you were using this process, all the film stocks that you edit will largely look the same in terms of color because they will all pretty much look neutral. So again, this is not a process to use when you want to accurately represent a film stock. This is a process to use when you want just natural, flat, even tones. At the end of the day though, this is a free process shared for anyone to use. If you don't like it, no harm done because you didn't pay anything for it. Me personally, I would probably continue to use this process as a first step in color correcting my C-41 negative scans because it is a very fast process. It gets me to a place that I'm happy with, a flat, neutral plane where I can edit on top of and make adjustments if I need to. As of right now, I'm very happy with the C-41 color correcting process, and if you need such a thing, I would highly recommend you to give this a try because again, it's free and it does a very good job. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, share it around, comment down below with any thoughts or questions that you may have on this process. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more content. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.